for whatever reason, school or just paying attention. But you know, North Carolina has always been a moderate southern state, by and large. And that's why I think North Carolina is such a great place to be from if you're a writer. People think Mississippi is a great place to be from if you're a writer. In Mississippi, it's Mississippi against the world, right? And that's why Mississippi's just like, you know, Faulkner, Percy, you know, Welty. But North Carolina is North Carolina against North Carolina, right? And so you have that like inbred contention, political contention, religious contention. Even Western North Carolina, coastal North Carolina, Piedmont, we have such distinct areas that were just constantly at war with each other. I mean, it was a state that's the basis of Cold Mountain, is this struggle in the war. It was a state ripped apart by the war as well, the Civil War. And so some of this stuff I knew. I knew that after Reconstruction failed, that free blacks and poor whites formed a fusionist party. They saw their interest as aligned. They gained some political power, and then the lynching started. Then you drive a wedge between races with threats or rumors of interracial relationships, and you have the coup in 1898 in Wilmington. It's another thing that's been buried by history. In Wilmington, North Carolina, in 1898, on Election Day, former Civil War veterans and white supremacists took to the street and murdered African Americans going to the polls. Wilmington was one of the most successful black towns in the country. They had national newspapers, city council leaders were black, the portmaster was black, and overnight it became a white town. People were slaughtered, they were run out of town, the black newspaper was burned. They called the governor and said, please send in the National Guard, and the governor refused. It's the only successful coup in American history, the only one. And I didn't learn about that until I went and did my master's degree in Greensboro, North Carolina, and studied by a writer named Charles Chestnut, who wrote about that coup in a novel that was published in 1901. He was an African-American writer from North Carolina, and it destroyed his career. You know, they said it was a bitter novel. It was just a true novel. It was just a true novel. So I knew those things, but I think looking at Ella, it became clear, looking at her life, that she knew something that I think we're really now, at this point in American history, seeing is that class divides us more than race does, practically, but race is still the thing that's used divisively, right? I don't think we've yet come to terms with the degree that class divides us, that we can convince people to act against their own economic self-interest by holding boogeymen out in front of them and distracting them and then doing something over here while we're distracting them. Ella knew that. Ella said, we're all poor. We're all poor. Poverty unites us more than race divides us. This is a class thing. And she would tell black organizers from New York, if you're not going to go into somebody's house just because your skin color is the same as theirs if you've got on fancy clothes. They're not going to listen to you. Because you're going to seem like you're putting on airs. You're going to seem like somebody who does not understand them. So you need to change clothes. You need to carry yourself a different way, because it's class. We're starving. We're dying. Our children are dying. So it's not race. It's going to break this thing open. It's class. It's uniting people. And a couple of years ago, I was back in Bessemer City, and I found the mill Ella worked at in Bessemer City. It's still there. It's kind of crumbling, but it's still in semi-operation. And then I went down into Stumptown, and which is still an African American area. And I was looking for where Ella's cabin was, and I knew that she had lived near a natural spring. I didn't know where it was exactly. So I was just on foot, just stopping people when they got out of their car, or checking their mail, or sitting on the porch, and hey, I'm looking for some fresh water. And so I met this older couple, and they invited me up on their porch. And so I was asking them, they said, why are you looking for a spring? And I said, well, there was a woman named Ella Mae Wiggins, and well, who was she? And I've never heard of a white person living in Stumptown, and what did she do? And they had never heard the story. They lived a mile from the mill Ella worked in, and she said, my dad. She said, they said, which mill did Ella work at? I said, she worked at American Mill number 2, and the woman said, my dad worked there in the 1920s. And I said, he would have known Ella, because she worked there in the 1920s. He would have known the only white woman living in Stumptown, worked at the only integrated mill in the county. He would have known her. She said, he died 6 years ago. right? And so we think history was a long time ago, but and she said he was clear as a bell. He could have told you everything you ever would have asked when the day he died, and I'd missed him by 6 years, and we were sitting there, and she kind of stepped back and she said, "You know why I've never heard this story, and why you never heard this story?" She said, "They don't want to teach you about the time that poor white people and poor black people got together and tried to change something." She said, "They don't want to teach you about that time." And so that was things like that kept surprising me, that I was having these kind of awakenings, and then talking to people who were simultaneously having these kind of awakenings. Not really an awakening, just a realization of how the educational system works. Like when we create curriculum, people don't ask LMA. People like LMA what they want their kids to be taught. They don't teach you that. She doesn't really get a word in. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have something you're working on now?
I'm under contract for another book, which is terrifying. The day I turned in my manuscript for my second manuscript to my editor, he said, "I know, you just turned this in, and do you have an idea for another book?" And I pitched the Mill book, a bad version of it. And then my agent called me and said, "David just made an offer on 2 more books. Like, what did you talk to him about?" And I went running downstairs and told my wife, I said, "David made an offer on 2 more books." And she said, "Congratulations, that's amazing. This means you may have a career. Are you sure you want to do it?" She said, "You need to think, are you sure you want to do it?" She said, "Because these writing and supporting these novels is killer. I mean, it's a killer." And so I said, "Let me think about it." And then I said, "Yeah." And so I'm under contract for another book. I'm already way behind on it, and I have some ideas in my mind, but nothing quite ready to formulate. I know it'll be set in North Carolina. I know that for certain. I've been doing a lot of essay writing for different publications, and that keeps me honest. I feel like I finally found, after my second book, my nonfiction voice. I finally found a voice that I can write about myself as myself. That was harder than writing novels, to be honest. And so I'm experimenting with that a little bit and staying busy doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am?
Yes. Would you talk about why communists from Moscow were in the American South organizing?
It was they weren't Russians, but they were American communists.
Okay.
So, when we think about the history of communism in America, and I'm not a scholar, I'm not a labor scholar, I'm not an American political scholar, but I think communism was born out of racial disparities. I think it was born out of class disparities in mills in New England, where people were dying. There was no protections for labor. There were no safety regulations. There were no child labor laws. I think it came out of the Victorian era, where people are writing about poverty. They're writing about hordes of children roaming the countryside because their parents have tossed them out because they can't support them. And so communism found a foothold in America because of that, especially with American intellectuals, right? Which is more thinking than doing oftentimes, and more intellectual than practical oftentimes. And so the Communist Party fielded serious candidates for a state office in places like New York and New England states, and didn't have the. We have to remember that we partnered with the communists in World War II. That's why many Americans were uncovered as being communists by McCarthy, because they had been sympathetic partners with Russia against Nazi Germany and against the communists in Spain. Ernest Hemingway was a communist. He worked for Soviet Russia. He was a spy. So it didn't quite have the taint that it does now. My parents grew up under McCarthy. I grew up under Reagan. It's no wonder they didn't hear about a communist-led mill strike where poor people asked for a living wage in their hometown. But I think that they came south because they saw that New England capital, Northern capital, was coming down south and finding people who were more desperate than the desperate people in New England, who would work for more impoverished wages than the impoverished people in New England. And so a lot of the big mills were owned by investors from up north, and not necessarily by locals. And so, I mean, in some ways, it is like a colonizing sentiment that you're going to come down and kind of work these people to death, really, and then get rid of them. But you know, out of for reasons like Lore, we have child labor laws, we have 40-hour work week, we have overtime pay, we have holidays off, we have protections that we probably wouldn't have otherwise had. And then, sir?
In A Land More Kind, I love the way you jump between the chapters of the characters.
Thank you.
When you were writing it, did you do like all of the sheriff's arc and all the kids and then piece it back together, or did you kind of jump around as you went through the
Sure,
chapters?
that's a good question. You know, the first draft I wrote in graduate school as part of my PhD dissertation, and it is awful. It is so bad. And it was a huge chunk of the boy Jess's narration, a huge chunk of Adelaide Lyle, she's the church matriarch's narration, the sheriff, and then the little boy closes it out again. And it was very imbalanced because I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to break the narrative down and then thread the narrative through with characters speaking at appropriate times to push the narrative forward. Because I'd never done it before. And so after that, I kept working at it and kept trying to think, you know, my wife's an attorney. I just thought, if this were a trial, who do we need to hear from so that the jury hears the full story? How would this be coordinated? And so I just kept thinking about who needs to tell this part. And it's not linear. The telling's not linear because in the South we're not linear. It's like your parents or your mom will say, I'm gonna tell you a story about Cindy. You know her, you went to school with her son. Oh, he was the best football player, but he married down. Oh boy. So the church, you know, and everything is, it's like somebody's spinning plates. They're spinning plates all over the place and you forget the original plate. And that's what I wanted the novel to feel like. And I wanted it to feel broken. But I wanted it to feel cohesive at the end. You know, Gaines does that, Faulkner does that. That's the symptom of modernism, where you take a story and you fracture it, and in that fracturing, it feels like life. And that I don't know, the shattered feeling of it feels like life.
It's just wonderful the way none of the characters know the whole story.
That's thank you for saying that. That's what I wanted, and I'm not smart enough to write a real mystery where the reader doesn't know and there's a big reveal. I genuinely, I'm not smart enough to do that. You know, writers I know who write mysteries where up until the last page you're like, oh, you're like reading it as fast as you can. I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. I would make way more money if I knew how to do that. Let me tell you, if I could do that, I would. But I can write a book where you know everything and you're waiting to see when the characters know everything. And hopefully the tension and your reading comes from what is going to happen when this knowledge is shared. How is it going to be dealt with? And that's kind of what I was writing toward in that book. And I wanted Jess to feel like the family. I wanted Adelaide to feel like the community. And I wanted Clem to feel like kind of the rational mind of the reader trying to put it all together. Maybe one more question. Yes, Ben?
You have hinted at formative influences in childhood, and then you talked about graduate school, but how did you become a writer?
How did I become a writer? Gosh. You know, I grew up in a family that told stories a lot, and I read a lot growing up. I either played in the woods, shot basketball in the driveway, or read books when it rained, you know. And I think that I learned to tell stories based on what I was reading, or movie, I would say, you know. And a lot of the books that had a big influence on me, I rewrote them with like my own characters when I was younger. I would just set them in North Carolina, and they'd be, you know, A Good Earth by Pearl S. Cash, you know. So I was copying, and I tell students that's how you learn to walk. You saw your parents walk. That's how you learn to speak the language your parents speak, because you hear them speaking. That's how Kobe Bryant learned to, you know, have the career arc he did, because he copied Michael Jordan. Spin around jumper, you know, ball handling, the same stuff. And so that's how I learned to write. Was I copied people that I had looked up to and people that I had admired. And I think what going to school did for me, I was with Charles Fraser a week ago he had a new book come out called Verena, which is a wonderful book. It's about Jefferson Davis's wife, Verena Howell. And I was joking, and I said, you know, you have Verena, Ron Rash has Serena. I said, my next book's going to be called Tina. It's going to be about a woman who manages a pool hall. And it's going to make so much money. Get that Fraser Rash money coming in. But he has a PhD, and he's like ashamed that he has a PhD in American Lit. He's like, it was a waste of time. But then you get him talking about it, he's like, but I did learn a lot about how books work. And that's what my background in literature has done for me, is that, you know, writing a book is like math. I know what I want the equation to equal. I just have to plug in the values on the other side of the equation to get us there. And when I read actively, and I'm always thinking, how did this author solve this problem of moving this character from a car to the inside of the house? And then I'll look at that equation and I'll figure out how to do it, right? And so when I read, I can read on like a theoretical level, but I also try to read on a craft level. And I think, you know, and I also went to graduate school because I just wasn't a good enough writer to start writing when I was 22 out of college. I was awful. I needed to read more books and find out how they worked and talk with people and have peers and have people in my workshops and my classes to have a beer with after class and talk about how books work. That was endlessly beneficial to me. Y'all have been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to the library and to Ben for inviting me and to Charles and